Alright, so as we know, Black Myth Wukong is set to release on the 20th of August this year, and they just released a benchmark tool, which is actually pretty good because you can test the performance before you actually buy the game. So we'll be testing the benchmark on an RTX 4070 Super that's paired with a 14600K of CPU. I have to think a bit, and then 32 gigabytes of DDR5, 6400 megatransfers per second CL32 memory. Now, I just spent 2 hours recording this video and I forgot to disable G-Sync, and this is a VRR capable capture card, but for some reason it just messed up my recording completely. So anyway, disable G-Sync and off we go. So we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. I just want to show you the settings quickly. I'm going to go a little bit quicker this time. I think it's maybe a blessing in disguise. So you do have DLSS, TSR, FSR, and XeSS, right? And DLSS, FSR, TSR both have, or all three have, a frame generation. So I'm not entirely sure what kind of frame generation there it's being used, because XeSS does not have frame generation. So I'm not sure if it is I know it is DLSS 3 frame generation when using DLSS, but the fact that it's not decoupled, or that you can't enable it when using XeSS, is kind of strange. And then just going through the settings here, we've got full ray tracing, which means path tracing, so you can just enable that. And then you have 3 presets here, so low, medium, and very high. There's no high. And graphic presets is just a low, medium, high, very high, and cinematic. So there's not a big difference between cinematic and very high when it comes to the frame rate. So I'll be testing full ray tracing at the end of the video, because you have to restart the app or the tool every time you change this. So we'll be just doing no path tracing benchmarks just yet, and at the end we'll test the path tracing at multiple resolutions as well. So just for now, 1080p cinematic, no DLSS, just DLAA. This is a slider, right? So as you move to 89% render resolution scale, it says it's DLSS mode quality, which is not 100% true, because 67% is DLSS quality, and then 50% is DLSS balanced, and 58% is DLSS balanced, and then 50% is DLSS performance, right? So we'll be using those 3 settings. So for now, just DLAA, 100% render resolution scale, cinematic, 1080p. I'm going to show you the first benchmark run just from start to finish, so you can see what it looks like, and then I'm just going to show you snippets of the subsequent runs, just to give you an idea of the performance, right? So the game, or the tool, has its own frame rate counter in the top left, so I just moved my RTSS to the top right, and you can see here with cinematic settings at 1080p with no upscaling, we are not able to even hit 60 frames per second here. Now the first part of the benchmark run is actually the more demanding one. It does show you a graph at the end, so we'll only be testing the more demanding scene of the benchmark. I'm still a little bit sick, so if there are places where my voice does not appear in the video, it's because I'm clearing my throat and I just cut that out. It's not that I'm being rude. I want to talk through the benchmark run here, but if I'm still a little bit sick and I'm just struggling to shake this cold, I've got the long cold. But you can see here we are dropping into the 50s, and at 1080p with the 4070 Super, that's kind of rough. But the cinematic preset, it does include, or I suspect it includes, ray tracing, right? It's just not path tracing. We do not have separate settings for ray tracing except for the path tracing portion, and we also do not have separate settings for ray reconstruction. And I do think that gets enabled by default when you enable full ray tracing. So full ray tracing in this game is path tracing, right? But now you can see we hit 60 frames per second, probably for the first time since we started this run. Our GPU usage is fully maxed out. We are using 216 watts on this 220 watt GPU, and usage is sitting at 100%, pretty much 99%, and the CPU is idling at 13%, 40 degrees Celsius, right? And that's actually the load is so heavily on the GPU in this game, even at 1080p. It's so it's actually DLSS will actually help a lot, I do believe. DLSS lowers the internal render resolution, so it should help a little bit. And spoiler alert, it does. As I said, I tested this for 2 hours previously, and the recording just did not work. But you can see our VRAM usage is actually quite respectable at 4.8 gigabytes of VRAM used at 1080p on the highest of high settings without path tracing, right? So I'm not sure if this will be reflective of the game as well. I hope so. So at the end, it actually gives you this, right? So it shows you the maximum FPS, the minimum FPS, whatever. We use our own metrics, and it shows you the settings. So you can see we've got the cinematic preset here, 100% super resolution, okay, whatever. So that's just the resolution scale for DLSS. I did disable motion blur just so that the video looks a little bit better on YouTube. And as you can see here, so at the start it's quite demanding, and then it gets better, and then this section here is the most demanding in the benchmark run, right? Apart from maybe this, but it's a very short section where it dips there. So we'll be testing mostly up until here, and then we will move on to the next setting. Let's go ahead and see what we actually need to do here. I'm going to enable DLSS quality here. Or actually, let's just drop this down to the high preset and see what goes. Because as I said, the cinematic preset is very heavy, and I'm not going to be doing the very high preset because the differences are very, very small. So go ahead and enable the high preset, and then we'll do the same run. I won't be showing you the full run, but just for comparison's sake. All right, so now on the high preset, we got a pretty decent bump to our frame rate here, around 30%, right? So, 30 frames per second, not 30%. We went from around 60 frames per second to almost 100, so that's like 40 frames per second at times. The very high preset, or the cinematic preset, is very heavy. I think it's there to make good YouTube videos, or good looking YouTube videos at least. And the stutter that I'm talking about, so just just look at the shadows. So the shadows do pop in quite a bit. Let me just move the mouse out of the way here. The shadows do pop in, especially on the heads in the water. So just look at the head on the right hand side in the distance. Like it might be a level of detail setting, but you can just see that the shadows do pop in a little bit, and there's that stutter that I'm talking about, and it happens 95% of the time. Anyway, doesn't really matter too much. We'll have to see what the performance is like when the game actually releases, and I will be making a video on that. I just want to show you what the performance is like, and that's exactly what this benchmark tool is for. So I'm going to stop the benchmark run here, and this is pretty much where we will end each run. But we had an average there of 90 frames per second, so a pretty decent boost to our frame rate over the cinematic preset actually. So I mean, just keep that in mind. All right, so next up, I'm just going to enable DLSS quality. As I said, I'm not the biggest fan of upscaling at 1080p, but I mean, DLSS looks fine at 1080p. I think it's just the visual artifacts do become a little bit more apparent, even without pixel peeping. But let's just see what the performance is like. Let's reset the numbers, and we gained around 20 frames per second, right? So we went from around 100 frames per second to, from around 90 to 100 frames per second to 120 to 130 frames per second. So a pretty decent bump to our frame rate. Remember, DLSS does not increase your performance. The GPU is as powerful as the GPU is. I do think we are slightly CPU bound here because our GPU power is sitting at 185 watts instead of 200 watts. But even though our GPU usage is sitting at 99%, right? So we might be CPU bound. But what I want to say is that DLSS renders internally at a lower resolution. So you're not increasing the performance of the GPU. The GPU stays as fast as it is. It's just you are reducing the load on the GPU, right? So it has an easier time rendering whatever. So getting a decent frame rate here. Remember, this is without full path tracing. That same stutter actually occurred there as well. And this is something, if you are fine with playing at using DLSS quality at 1080p. Definitely something you can use. As you can see, the performance is pretty good. The frame rate is high enough for a decent experience anyway. The game should be fine at 60 frames per second. I do think that maybe frame generation at 60 frames per second is not the best idea, because from the videos I've seen of this game, it's actually quite fast paced, the combat. So you will need to just be aware of the input latency when you enable frame generation at a lower base frame rate, right? So just one thing, every time I run the benchmark, it changes this by 1. Okay, so just keep that in mind when you run your own benchmark. So I set it to 67, and the moment the benchmark run completes, it goes to 66, and the next run it goes to 65. So anyway, so using the exact same settings, just with the frame generation enabled here, let's see if we can get a consistent high frame rate experience. I'm not going to say high refresh rate experience, because it does not reduce the input latency, and that's basically the meaning of a high refresh rate experience, right? It's a high frame rate with lower input latency, which you don't get with the frame generation enabled. So this is what I saw earlier as well. The increase to our frame rate when we use frame generation is not that big. Unless we use full path tracing, we'll get to that. But actually, when we use full path tracing, the frame rate gains when using DLSS and frame generation is much better, or much higher. All right, so I don't think I'm going to do too much. I'm going to stop this one a little bit earlier just to save some time. But you can see 130 frames per second. Plenty fine. 120 frames per second previously without frame generation, also plenty fine. So I mean, it's great that there are all these options to choose from. It's there's an option for everyone, and there's that stutter again. Okay, anyway, I'm going to keep quiet about the stutter, but you can see that stutter does bring our 0.1% lows down quite a bit. All right, so 140 frames per second here. Let's move on to 1440p. All right, we're now at 1440p, and frame generation, DLSS upscaling have been turned off, and we are running on the high preset. I'm going to change this to the cinematic preset. I just want to show you. It actually does say that the current settings exceed the recommended settings, even on the high preset, right? If we scale this down to, I think, there we go. So now the error disappears. So 76% resolution scale is too much. All right, so 100% resolution scale it is. We are going with the cinematic preset here. Remember, we were not able to maintain 60 frames per second at 1080p. This is not going to go well. I just want to show you what the frame rate is like. Just a quick run, and then we'll use more respectable settings, right? So 37, let's call it 40 frames per second, right? But just look at the frame time graph. Not the smoothest of frame time graphs. Not the smoothest I've ever seen. I can't even say smoothest. Sure, like the game looks plenty good, right? I do have some issue with some of the water particles. Sometimes it looks a little bit grainy, but other than that, the game does look pretty good. I do think that some developers, or most engines actually, do have an issue with the water. If we have a look at Avatar, for example, one of the best looking games, it also had issues with the water. But anyway, the rest of the game still looks plenty good. There's still some pop-in even on the cinematic preset, but some of that actually gets alleviated when we enable path tracing. Anyway, so 40 frames per second, and not the ideal experience here, but see, now that stutter did not occur. So as I said, not sure exactly what causes that. All right, so 40 frames per second. Sure, if you're aiming for 30 frames per second, lock it to 30 and use these settings. You'll have a good time if that's your jam. I do prefer a higher frame rate. So let's quickly see. I'm just going to drop this down to the high preset, right? High preset and without any upscaling, and see what the difference in the frame rate is. Remember, around 35 to 40 frames per second previously. We should be close to 60 now, I believe. And we might not maintain 60 frames per second at all times, but we are pretty close, right? So we we gained around 50% in our frame rate. We went from 40 to 60, at 70 even at times. So cinematic preset, it's for the elite. If you've got a 4090, use the cinematic preset. The rest of us plebs, unfortunately, we have to use optimized settings. So keep an eye out for people that do optimized setting videos. You'll probably have to make use of that to fine-tune your experience. Yeah, I just test the presets. So not terrible. 60 frames per second, native 1440p on the high preset. I do think that there's still some ray tracing, etc. enabled here. Not entirely sure, as the settings don't really say much, but I do think it is. Seeing that it is Unreal Engine 5, there might be Lumen, hardware Lumen, and that kind of stuff. Anyway, so we got an average of 64 frames per second, not terrible. So let's see what happens when we enable DLSS Super Resolution, and then we'll enable frame generation, and then we'll move on to the to 4K. So I know I'll do a full-blown video once the game actually releases. For all we know, the game might not even run this well when, or not this well, the same way when it actually releases, right? So for all we know, we might run into CPU bottlenecks. That's basically the biggest issue with in-game benchmarks, is that they are usually fully GPU bound, and it does not always reflect a true gaming experience, because yeah, you might get to scenarios where you're CPU bound. Not saying it's going to be the case in this game, but anyway, so we're getting 90 frames per second here. So we went from around 60, 70 frames per second to 90 to 100 frames per second. A pretty decent boost to our frame rate. Our CPU power usage went up slightly. That makes sense, because we are now rendering internally at a lower resolution with DLSS. GPU power is sitting at around 205, so not as heavy as it was previously when we were seeing 221. Anyway, VRAM usage is sitting at 4.3 gigabytes, which is respectable, I think, considering the visuals. Now, the game is not fully open world, so that might explain it. It's from what we can see, it's more smaller linear levels, so probably a lot less to actually load into the VRAM. That's why VRAM usage is a bit lower, but it's I think it's pretty good, the VRAM usage. And Unreal Engine 5, some games do have good VRAM management. I did a video on it a few weeks ago, and Unreal Engine 5 is not too bad when it comes to VRAM usage. But our average frame rate here is sitting at 94 frames per second. Let's enable frame generation, and then we'll move on to 4K. Alright, so I just had to change this back to 67%. So DLSS frame generation, enable DLSS set to quality pretty much, high preset still. And we were seeing around 90 to 100 frames per second previously. So let's see what kind of difference frame generation makes. As I said earlier, I actually saw a bigger difference when we actually started using ray tracing, or full ray tracing, path tracing. So we gained between 25 to 25 frames per second here. Not the biggest difference that frame generation can make. Remember, frame generation actually works better when you are CPU bound, and we are pretty GPU bound in this benchmark run, so it makes sense here, except you'll be surprised when we get to the ray tracing or the path tracing benchmarks. Frame generation makes a much bigger difference, and I really don't understand exactly why. It might be when we use DLSS. Remember, path tracing, like it's light bounces, that kind of stuff, and it's also resolution dependent. So if you enable DLSS, the lower rendering or the lower internal resolution gets applied to the bounce lighting as well. So it makes sense that DLSS makes a bigger difference when we use ray tracing, but I did not expect frame generation to make a bigger difference. Anyway, so getting an average of 117, 118 frames per second, so around 20 frames per second more than previously. So not the biggest difference with frame generation enabled here. Alright, so as I said, I'm not going to be testing all the settings here. We'll do that once the game launches, when we can actually test input latency and that kind of stuff, because at the moment we don't know what the input latency feels like when we enable frame generation. So I'm going to just change this to 4K. Let's do everything live so you guys can see I'm not cheating. Now the super resolution changes. So let's do 100% render resolution scale 4K on the high preset. Okay, just to get an idea of what the performance is like. I don't think it's going to be good at all. But the only reason why I want to do this is because I want to see what the VRAM usage is like. Okay, so 30 frames per second, game looks plenty good. We are seeing 6.3 gigabytes of VRAM used. Now that's not the highest setting. We do get a cinematic experience when, I mean, a more cinematic experience when we use the cinematic preset. But 6.3 gigabytes of VRAM used is not terrible at 4K high. And the frame time graph looks very choppy. I'm not sure if that actually will translate to micro stuttering. It might, but once again, we'll need to be able to move around, move the mouse and stuff like that to actually feel the micro stuttering. Anyway, so this is actually, as I said, it's actually not horrible if you are aiming for a 30 frames per second experience. I do know some people that do 4K 30. This is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that, and you should be able to maintain that no problem. This is if the performance here translates to actual gameplay as well. We can't be sure until the game releases, but from what we, I mean, it looks pretty good. It plays not too horribly. It's heavy, like it's an Unreal Engine 5 engine game. What am I saying? It's an Unreal Engine 5 game, so it is heavy, right? They typically are, whether it's an optimization issue or just heavy. Like I don't know. It's just sometimes they are just a little bit too heavy to my liking. Based on the visuals that you usually, or that you sometimes get, the performance just does not justify the visuals, or the visuals do not justify the performance. My opinion, anyway. I think this game looks pretty good. So anyway, so let's quickly just enable DLSS quality here. So 67%, and yeah, I think that's it. I think we should be able to get close to 60 frames per second now. All right, so 50. I mean, when we go down the valley, we should be able to hit 60 frames per second, as you can see there. But not able to maintain it. Well, I mean, we won't be able to maintain it. That's just the way it is. But it's not terrible. So DLSS quality, you can drop down to 4K DLSS performance actually, and it'll still look plenty good. Sure, there will be some artifacting. Don't mind the screen tearing. I do have a so my setup here is I've got a secondary PC with a 4K 60 capture card, right? So that's why my videos are always recorded in 60 Hertz. It's not an issue because YouTube is also only 60 frames per second, so there's no benefit at all to increasing the refresh rate on the capture card, unless I slow it down and do frame capture analysis, which I don't do. Anyway, so then from my PC, this PC that I'm currently doing the benchmark run on, it goes to a secondary PC with a capture card, and then I use the pass-through to go to a 4K monitor, so I can actually see what the game looks like at 4K if the resolution is set to 4K, and I just think that way there's no performance penalty when we record, because nothing is being recorded locally. All right, so there we have it, 60 frames per second average. That's what you want, right, at 4K 60. So I'm going to do one last test at 4K before we enable frame generation. I just want to enable DLSS balance, because I do think we should be able to get away with the high preset, right? You can obviously drop the preset down to medium, but before we do that, I just want to set this to I think DLSS balanced should get us 60 frames per second at all times using these settings. That's what I aim for 4K anyway on this GPU. It's not, in my view, this RTX 4070 Super is not a 4K GPU. It is pretty bandwidth limited when it comes to VRAM. It is VRAM limited when it comes to 4K. But now you can see we are seeing 60 to 70 frames per second. So still on the high preset, DLSS balanced at 4K, still looks plenty good. You can drop down to performance, as I said earlier. You'll start seeing some issues with leaves. These do seem to look like pine trees, right? They've got needles as branches. These ones in the distance there. I might be wrong. I don't know much about trees, but just looking at it, previous, not these. I don't know what I'm talking about. This one right in front of us, it looks like it has needles for branches, right? So this actually does seem to shimmer quite a bit, or does start to shimmer quite a bit when we use DLSS performance, even at 4K. But it still looks good, right? It's slightly distracting, but not too much. Only when you go to ultra performance, it does become a bit of an issue, for me personally anyway. Other people don't like upscaling at all. That's perfectly fine. I don't mind it. I do prefer a higher frame rate over stunning visuals. I do like both. So, and super resolution or upscaling, like, is a compromise that is able to get you both, right? Anyway, so 68 frames per second, 69 frames per second, nice. And let's now enable frame generation. I think we should be okay with frame generation now. As I said, I'm not able to test the input latency myself. Sure, we can enable the Nvidia overlay and it'll show you average PC latency, whatever. But that doesn't always translate to how the game really feels. You have to play the game to actually know how the input latency feels. So let's just change the spec to 58. You see it changes all the time. So 58 render resolution scale, frame generation enabled. I think I mean, Nvidia and AMD recommend 60 frames per second base frame rate before enabling frame generation, and I do agree with them, at least 60, but I personally aim for higher frame rates, base frame rates, before I enable frame generation. I prefer to get around 90 frames per second before enabling frame generation, just to try and mitigate the input latency. And also, the higher the base frame rate, the less artifacting you'll see. Anyway, so there's a little bit of shimmering in the trees now, which I did not really notice earlier. I'm not sure if it'll come across in the recording or not, but the trees are shimmering, the tree branches, when the camera pans and light shines through the trees. There's quite a bit of shimmering there, which is kind of strange for frame generation. Not sure if it's just on my system, or maybe it's because I'm doing a pass through. It shouldn't really be. Anyway, so maybe if you see the same thing, just let me know in the comments. It'll be interesting to know. But you can see an average of 90 frames per second, which is plenty good at 4K, right? Sure, it's not 4K internal. We are rendering at I mean, it's DLSS balance, so it's somewhere between it's what, 1440p, I think. Anyway, so 1440p up to 4K, 90 frames per second, not terrible. All right, let's do some path tracing tests. Right, so I'm going to be using, let me get rid of that. I'm going to be using DLSS at 100% resolution scale. I'm going to use a very high full path tracing level, full ray tracing level, and just a high preset, right? So we are currently at 1080p. We need to restart the game for the effects to take effect. Or for the changes to take effect. So let's restart the benchmark tool, and then these are the settings that we'll be using. All right, so full path tracing enabled, 1080p native on the high preset, and we are getting 40 to 50 frames per second. It's actually a little bit better than my previous run for some reason. I don't know why. Previously, I saw around 30 to 40 frames per second. Now it's 40 to 50 frames per second. Anyway, so I'm glad that I had the opportunity, or I was forced to redo this run. The water still looks a little bit grainy to me, but as I said, I just think many developers have issues with the water. It does look good in some places when the water moves a little bit more slowly, but when when there's a lot of water moving together and you see the white splashes, it does look a little bit grainy. So over here it looks pretty good. The refraction, everything looks good. The reflection of the fire in the water, maybe a little bit more realistic, but it doesn't look fantastic. And as I said, I don't think, like, there's no toggle for ray reconstruction, so I do think it gets enabled by default, right? So 40 frames per second here, 43 to be exact. Not the best experience, especially considering we're at 1080p, but path tracing is very, very demanding, right? So let's go ahead and let's just see what DLSS can do here for us. Just remember 45 frames per second, right? And as I said earlier, in my earlier testing, the DLSS made a pretty big difference. So let's just go DLSS set to quality, so 67. Everything else is still exactly the same. Once again, just doing everything live here. And let's click benchmark. I do cut this part out though. All right, so we went from 45 to 75 frames per second in this specific spot. It'll reach 80 when we go under the bridge. So an almost doubling of our frame rate. Like, fine, if you want to drill down to actual percentages, it's probably more like 75%, whatever. But it's a very decent bump to our frame rate, and definitely needed when you use path tracing, right? You have to use upscaling. Even on a 4090 at 1440p, you will have to use upscaling when using path tracing, right? It's just extremely demanding. And you have to make the choice whether it's worth it to you or not, whether the visuals justify the performance. I personally, on a 4070 Super, I don't use path tracing. I do use ray tracing, but just with DLSS set to balanced, and then when I enable frame generation, games that support it, and I do get a pretty decent experience. But full path tracing, I just leave that to the elite. Right, so 71 frames per second average, pretty decent bump to our frame rate. So let's just go ahead and enable frame generation. So this is where I previously saw a pretty big gain, right? When we weren't using ray tracing, you see that thing keeps on changing. When we weren't using path tracing, full ray tracing, path tracing, whatever. So when we weren't using full ray tracing, the performance gains with frame generation, not performance gains, the frame rate gains, it was around 20%, right? 20 frames per second. So let's see what it is now. In my previous testing, it was actually pretty decent, much better than previously. So let's just reset our numbers, and so now we're getting 105, 100, it'll go to 110 probably under the bridge here. So going from 70 frames per second to 110 frames per second, that's a 40 frames per second bump to our frame rate. And it's definitely a bigger boost to the frame rate than without ray tracing, and that's something that I don't fully understand. I'm too stupid to understand exactly why, and to explain to you exactly why that's happening, because we are fully GPU bound here. You can see we're using 216 watt of our available 220 watt power limit. There's still some pop in, especially the reflections. They do seem to pop in, as you can see there in the distance. So level of detail is not completely fixed by using path tracing. The shadows do look much better, and there's a lot less shadow pop in, but the reflections do pop in a little bit. I have to think about what I wanted to say there. So, okay, so fine. We saw around a 30 frames per second increase with frame generation, yeah, right? So slightly better than what we saw without ray tracing. Anyway, so that's just how it goes. So an average of 100 frames per second, pretty decent, but once again, it's 1080p, and I'm not sure what the input latency is like. So let's go ahead and move to 1440p. All right, so we're at 1440p, and we will test that native first without frame generation, still on the high preset. Once again, just to see what the performance hit is. previously we were just below 60 frames per second, I believe, on the high preset, right? We were hugging 60 frames per second without full path tracing. So let's see how this goes. Right, and a cinematic experience it is. Lock it to 24 frames per second, you'll maintain 24 frames per second, and you've got a true cinematic experience, right? So we're not even able to hit 30 frames per second. I mean, we'll hit it, but we're not maintaining. Are we going to hit it? There we go. So VRAM usage is still okay, right? So we are sitting at 6.5 gigabytes of VRAM used. That'll come down a little bit when we enable DLSS super resolution, and then it'll go up a little bit again when we enable frame generation. But not the way you should be playing this game. I do think you will struggle a bit, seeing that it is a faster, action-paced ARPG with Souls-like elements, whatever. The combat seems to be pretty fast, and I do think you will have some issues with input latency, especially just timing your dodges and that kind of stuff, right? Anyway, the game looks plenty good. I think now suddenly, okay, there's the reflection. So still has some issues with the reflection popping, that kind of stuff. Performance is not ideal. I don't think I know anybody that'll play like this, right? So I think we might have to use DLSS balanced at least. Once again, there's a little bit of screen tearing there. So let's just go ahead and let's do DLSS quality just for a comparison, and then we'll see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. For all we know, we might only need DLSS quality, which I mean, it'll be good if that is the case. So let's just go ahead and always click on display. So let's just drop this down to 67%, which is the true DLSS quality resolution percentage, right? So everything else is still exactly the same. Once again, just doing everything live so people can't call these fake. And let's reset our numbers. I don't think we'll hit 60 actually. Yeah, that's 50 frames per second. I don't think I'm going to let this run too long. I don't think we'll see 60 frames per second even, not even once. So there we go. So I mean 50 odd frames per second with DLSS quality. I mean we doubled our frame rate pretty much. Okay, so we went from 26 to 52 frames per second just by using DLSS quality. So that's a very decent bump to our frame rate. So let's see if we use DLSS balanced, so 58. There's not a big difference, right? It's like a 9% difference in the resolution scale. So technically we should see like a small boost to our frame rate. And look at that, 60 frames per second. And seeing that this is the more demanding actual scene in this benchmark run, it's the very start, we should be able to closely maintain 60 frames per second, or close to it, I should say. There is a little bit more of a demanding scene just as we go around the corner here, but we should be close enough to 60 frames per second to not let it bother you, because if you enable VSync and G-Sync and reflex, for example, on a 60 Hertz display, it'll cap the frame rate to 57 frames per second anyway. So as long as we drop below 57, damn it. Okay, so I mean it's pretty close. It's not ideal, but it's pretty close to 60 frames per second, right? So 54 frames per second there, and our lows are actually pretty good. The stutter there around the corner is a lot less pronounced at a lower frame rate, so getting an average of 58 frames per second, while our 0.1% lows are sitting at 46. Very, very closely spaced together, and that just means that it's going to be pretty consistent, right? And our frame time graph doesn't look bad at all either. All right, so not able to maintain a full 60 frames per second there. We might have to use DLSS performance, but at 1080p out 1440p, it's not the way to go for me personally. So let's just enable frame generation. Sure, we will see a decent boost to our frame rate here. How that will affect your input latency, I don't know. Let's make sure that stays at 58. because we are below 60 frames per second when we enable frame generation. Yeah, so the input latency hit will be a lot more pronounced. And as I said, unfortunately, I'm not able to test exactly that, but we'll test that when the game releases on the 20th. Don't forget, the 20th of August. So 90 frames per second. We gained around 30 frames per second. So another almost 50% gain to our frame rate, right? Remember, 60 plus 50% is 90. So once again, with frame generation without full ray tracing, the gains were only like 20 to 30%, right? So it's that's what I mean, that frame generation makes a bigger difference when we actually use ray tracing. So kind of weird. I'm hoping Sebastian can tell me exactly why that is. I'll ask him on Twitter. So we're getting a decent-ish frame rate here. Once again, it might be an issue with the input latency now that that frame time, or that stutter was actually pretty big. It dropped our 0.1% lows quite a bit, but other than that, like there's like 3 or 4 stutters in this whole benchmark run. So sorry, I'm just going to clear my throat quickly. There are like 3 or 4 major stutters in the whole benchmark run, and hopefully they don't make it into the full game, but I'm not holding my breath. Anyway, so 85 frames per second here, reverted to Afrikaans there for a second, and 0.1% low, sitting at 41, not terrible. So let's move on to 4K. Once again, I'm not sure how playable these settings would be when we actually take the input latency into consideration. Anyway, so let's just change this to 4K, and I don't think we should be. Let's drop this down to medium, right? We're going to start with the DLSS without frame generation first, right? The game, it's a slideshow at 4K with the full path tracing on the high preset. Okay, so 67, it still says that it's not recommended. What does it say? So it wants us to run DLSS performance at least. Okay, anyway, so 67%, so DLSS quality, path tracing very high, and medium preset. I'm not holding my breath. I don't think this is going to go well at all. Right, so back to our cinematic experience here with DLSS to quality. As I said, at 4K you can drop down to DLSS balanced, even performance. It still looks plenty good, and it'll run much better. So 30 frames per second. I do know people that play at 4K 30. That's perfectly fine, each to their own. But our frame time graph looks very, very inconsistent, and I do think those might actually translate to micro stuttering in the game. So let's not waste too much time here. I do think let's drop this down to DLSS performance, which is 50%, before we start enabling frame generation. Because if you enable frame generation now at 25, 30 frames per second, it's going to be terrible. So let's drop this down to 50%, because now we don't get the warning for exceeding the settings, exceeding expectations at least. So 40 I don't think it's going to go well either. I mean, that's not a 4K GPU, so we should not expect it to do path tracing at 4K at respectable settings, at respectable frame rates. And I mean, this is exactly what we're seeing here, 40-ish frames per second. If that's your jam, if you're happy with 40 frames per second, go for it. Like, these are the settings to use. Personally, if you play at 4K with the GPU, maybe just disable path tracing, or like just use lower settings of path tracing. As I said, we'll test all that in the game actually, when we can move around and do actual gameplay as well. So one last test before we enable frame generation. Let's drop this down all the way to 25%, right? So this should be 540p, I believe. 540p upscale to 4K. It might. I don't think it's going to look good. but we might hit 60 frames per second. There we go. So 70 frames per second even. And while the water looks blurry, the rest of the scenery doesn't look too terrible. I really expected a lot worse, especially in the finer details of the leaves. I expected that to be a complete blurry mess. This is not perfect at all. I'm not sure how well this will come across in the YouTube video, but it's not terrible. Like 540p. I think it's 540p. I might be mistaken. Anyway, you do see some shimmering in the trees, especially when the light shines through it and the camera pans, and that might become a little bit distracting for some. How that will look while actually playing the game, I don't know, but we are able to hit 60 frames per second here, which is what you want, right? You have to make some sacrifices to get there, but here we are. Anyway, so let's just enable frame generation, and then we're going to end this video. Right, so the exact same settings. This time the super resolution setting couldn't change because it's as low as it can go. So frame generation enabled. As I said, you can use different settings here, right? I'm just here to test worst case scenario. We'll test different settings when the actual game releases, and we'll actually compare the results to these benchmark settings. So just with frame generation enabled now, exact same settings, resolution scale set to 25%. On the medium preset, upscale to 4K. And so once again, we went from around 60 to 70 frames per second to around 100 frames per second. So once again, a pretty decent boost to our frame rate. Not exactly 50% as we saw at 1440p, but I'll put the percentage in post edit. So 90 frames per second, yeah. Not terrible. The game doesn't look horrible. I was really expecting it to look a lot worse when using 25% render resolution scale, but it's not too terrible. Sure, some things do look a little bit blurry, but I'm also not sure if it's just part of the whole vignetting and chromatic aberration, all that kind of stuff, that gets applied to the edges of the screens, whatever. Just disable all that kind of stuff, but not a terrible experience. As I said, I'd like to actually test this with actual gameplay to feel what the input latency feels like. But for now, this is where we are going to leave this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.